They said she was building a coffin. That's what Martha heard them whisper at the general store when she bought her last load of corrugated metal sheeting. A coffin, they said, or maybe a tomb. The kind of structure you'd expect from someone who'd given up, not someone trying to survive. The men leaned against the counter, arms crossed, shaking their heads as she loaded the panels into her ancient pickup truck. One of them actually laughed, a short, dismissive bark that cut through the October air like the first warning of winter. But if you're watching this right now, you already know something those men didn't. You know that the difference between survival and surrender often looks ridiculous until the moment it saves your life. So before we go any further into Martha's story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories I bring you aren't just tales. They're blueprints for resilience, maps through the impossible, proof that the wisdom the crowd dismisses is often the wisdom that survives. Subscribe, and you'll never miss another story about the people who built their own salvation while everyone else was still arguing about whether it was possible. Martha had arrived in the valley 8 months earlier with nothing but a diesel generator, a set of carpentry tools that had belonged to her father, and a parcel of land she'd inherited from an aunt she'd never met. The land itself was considered worthless, rocky sloped, positioned at the base of a ridge that funneled wind like a natural wind tunnel. No well, no septic, no power lines within 2 miles. The kind of property that gets passed down through generations not because anyone wants it, but because no one can sell it. She'd spent those first months living in a canvas tent, working dawn to dusk, and the valley locals watched with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. There were bets placed at the tavern. How long would she last? Would it be the black flies in June that drove her out, or the realization that winter in this valley wasn't something you survived through optimism alone? But Martha didn't leave. She cleared brush, she dug a latrine, she hand-dug a shallow well that gave her enough water to wash and cook, though not enough for luxury. And then, in late August, she started building something that made absolutely no sense to anyone who saw it. The structure was based on a Quonset hut design, that distinctive half-cylinder shape that looks like a steel rainbow lying on its side. Military surplus, World War II vintage. The kind of buildings that were meant to be temporary but ended up lasting decades because efficiency doesn't care about aesthetics. Martha had found plans in an old engineering manual and adapted them with whatever materials she could scavenge or afford. The frame was bent rebar and salvaged pipe, arched over a foundation of stacked stone and pressure-treated timber. The skin was a patchwork of corrugated metal panels, some new, most scavenged from demolished barns and abandoned warehouses. It looked, quite frankly, like a massive aluminum can that had been cut in half and stuck into the hillside. The mockery was immediate and relentless. Why would anyone build a metal shell in a climate where winter temperatures could drop to 20 below zero? Metal conducts cold. Everyone knows that. It was basic physics, they said. She might as well sleep inside a refrigerator. And the shape made no sense either. All that curved surface would just shed heat, offer no insulation, create condensation problems. A rectangular cabin made sense. 4 walls, a peaked roof, proper insulation bats, a wood stove. That's what you built if you wanted to survive. What Martha was building looked like a desperate art project. The kind of thing that would photograph well in ruin after she'd frozen to death inside it. But Martha wasn't building what they thought she was building. She wasn't building a metal shell. She was building a thermal envelope, a heat battery, a structure that worked with physics rather than against it. And the people who mocked her simply couldn't see it because they were looking at the surface rather than the system. The first layer of her wisdom was in the foundation. She'd positioned the structure so that it was partially bermed into the hillside, with the back third actually dug into the slope. The earth itself, once you get below the frost line, maintains a relatively constant temperature. In this region, about 4 feet down, the soil stays at roughly 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. By nestling the back of her structure into the hill, Martha was tapping into that thermal mass. The earth wouldn't keep her warm by itself, but it would prevent the brutal heat loss that happens when every surface of your shelter is exposed to sub-zero air. The stone foundation was double-walled, not because Martha had excess stone, but because she understood thermal bridging. The outer wall was dry stacked fieldstone, basically a decorative and structural facade, but 6 inches inward was another wall, this one mortared, and the gap between them was packed with compacted clay mixed with straw. A poor man's insulation, but insulation nonetheless. And because the foundation extended 18 inches above grade, the wooden floor joists that sat on top of it were elevated above the frozen ground, with the crawl space beneath packed with loose hay that she replaced every autumn. Cold air is heavy, it sinks. By creating a dead air space beneath her floor, she ensured that the coldest air would pool below her living space, not inside it. The Quonset arch itself was actually a double skin, though you had to look carefully to see it. The outer layer was the patchwork corrugated metal that everyone mocked, but inside, Martha had constructed a second arch, 18 inches smaller in diameter, made from salvaged tongue-and-groove boards, rough pine planks, and even sections of old plywood. The gap between the metal exterior and the wooden interior was where her real genius lived. She'd filled that cavity with a combination of materials. At the bottom, where moisture would be a problem, she'd used crushed stone for drainage. In the middle sections, she'd packed in bales of compressed straw, the kind sold as animal bedding, which she'd bought at bulk discount from a farmer clearing out last year's stock. And at the very top of the arch, where heat would naturally rise and try to escape, she'd used bags of shredded paper and cardboard that she'd been collecting for months, compressed and sealed in plastic feed bags to prevent moisture absorption and settling. Was it conventional insulation? No. Was it rated and certified? Absolutely not. But it created 18 inches of dead air space filled with materials that resisted heat transfer, and that's what insulation is. The R value might not have been impressive by modern standards, but it was infinitely better than bare metal, and it cost her almost nothing. The thermal bridge problem that everyone warned about, where the metal ribs would conduct cold directly through the insulation, she had addressed by wrapping each structural rib with strips of old carpet and burlap before the outer skin went on. Again, not elegant, but effective. The ends of the Quonset were closed with double walls of stacked cordwood construction, where short logs are laid crosswise in a wall with mortar between them, creates another natural insulation system. The wood itself insulates, the mortar provides thermal mass, and if you're careful about your mix and your chinking, the wall can be surprisingly airtight. Martha had mixed her mortar with extra sawdust and lime, creating a lighter, more insulating mixture than standard cement. The entrance was on the south-facing end, protected by a small vestibule she'd framed out with salvaged 2x4s and covered with more metal panels. An airlock, essentially, somewhere to shed snowy clothes and boots before entering the main space. And more importantly, a buffer that prevented the interior door from opening directly to the outside wind. Inside, the space was small, perhaps 14 feet wide and 20 feet long, not luxurious but sufficient. The floor was simple, planking with rag rugs she'd woven from fabric scraps. But the center of everything, the heart of her thermal system, was the rocket mass heater she'd built along the north wall. This is where Martha's engineering really shone, and where the mockery from the locals showed how little they understood about heating efficiency. A conventional wood stove, the kind everyone told her she should install, is actually a remarkably inefficient device. You burn wood in a firebox, and most of that heat goes straight up the chimney. You're essentially heating the sky. The stove radiates heat into the room, sure, but you need to keep feeding it constantly because there's no thermal storage. The moment the fire dies, the heat is gone. A rocket mass heater works on completely different principles. Martha had built hers from a combination of fire brick, clay, and a salvaged steel barrel. The firebox was small, just a vertical feed tube where she could insert small diameter wood, typically sticks no thicker than her wrist. The combustion chamber was heavily insulated with clay and perlite mixture, which meant the fire burned incredibly hot, hot enough to achieve almost complete combustion with very little smoke. The exhaust from that combustion chamber didn't go straight up. Instead, it was routed horizontally through a long thermal mass bench that she'd constructed from cob, a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. The bench ran along the north wall, about 18 inches high and 3 feet wide, and the exhaust gases from her efficient little fire traveled through channels inside that thermal mass for nearly 15 feet before finally venting through an insulated chimney. By the time the exhaust reached the outside, it was barely warm. All that heat had been absorbed by hundreds of pounds of clay and stone, which radiated it slowly into the room for hours, sometimes days. After the fire had gone out, she could burn a small bundle of sticks, maybe 15 pounds of wood, and the thermal mass would keep the space comfortable for 18 to 24 hours. The top of the mass bench was plastered smooth, and that's where Martha slept, on a thin mattress, directly on top of her heat battery. The warmth radiated up through her bedding all night. No need for electric blankets or heavy quilts, though she had those too. Just the steady, gentle heat of thermal mass, the most ancient heating system humanity ever devised. But the system only worked because of the envelope that contained it. And that envelope, that ridiculous-looking metal structure, was about to face a test that would prove whether Martha was a fool or a prophet. The first week of December brought the usual cold temperatures in the 20s at night, 30s during the day. Martha burned her rocket heater once a day, usually in the evening, and the space stayed comfortable. The locals continued their amused surveillance. A few even made the trek out to her property to see if she was still alive, though they claimed they were just passing by. She offered them tea, showed them her system if they asked, and endured their polite skepticism. Metal building in winter. Poor thing, she'd learned. Then the forecasts changed. A polar vortex was dipping south, they said. Arctic air, the kind that turns spit to ice before it hits the ground. The Weather Service issued warnings, blizzard conditions, whiteout, sustained winds of 40 miles per hour with gusts to 60. Wind chill values approaching 50 below zero. Duration 4 to 6 days, maybe longer. Stock up, stay inside. Check on elderly neighbors, be prepared for power outages. This was the kind of storm that killed people. The valley went into preparation mode. Generators were tested. Propane tanks topped off, wood piles restacked closer to back doors. The hardware store sold out of pipe heating, cable, and foam insulation. People who heated with electricity bought space heaters as backup. People who heated with wood bought extra tarps to cover their stacks. The conversation at the general store turned to Martha. Should someone check on her? Should someone suggest she come into town? Stay at the community center where they'd set up cots and a warming station? She's going to die out there in that thing. Someone said it'd be on all of them if they didn't at least offer. A delegation of 2 men drove out to her property on the afternoon before the storm was set to arrive. The sky was already turning that particular shade of gray that means heavy snow, and the wind was picking up, sharp and purposeful. They found Martha outside, calmly securing loose items, tying down the metal panels she'd used to create a windbreak for her woodpile, checking the chimney cap. They made their offer. She thanked them. She declined. They insisted. She smiled, the kind of smile that contains absolutely no uncertainty, and said she'd be fine. They looked at her Quonset structure, at the metal skin already creaking in the wind, and they shook their heads. Suit yourself, they said. But when this is over, we're coming back to check, and we're bringing shovels just in case. She thanked them again and went back to her preparations. The storm arrived that night like an invading army. The wind came first, a steady howling that built from a whisper to a shriek in less than an hour. Then the snow, not falling so much as flying horizontally, hard pellets that stung exposed skin and piled into drifts with geometric speed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. Then another 10. The darkness was total, the kind of black that exists when clouds block the stars and snow fills the air, and there's no ambient light for 50 miles. Inside the valley's conventional homes, the battle began immediately. Wood stoves were stoked high, fed constantly, and still the cold crept in. Electric baseboards ran at maximum, driving power bills into territory that would hurt come January, and still the floors were cold. The windows rhymed with frost on the inside. The wind found every gap, every imperfect seal, every place where insulation had settled or been installed poorly. Drafts became obvious. People stuffed towels under doors, hung blankets over windows, wore 2 pairs of socks and slept in their winter coats. The power lines went down on the second day, knocked over by ice and wind, and suddenly half the valley was dependent entirely on backup systems and would heat. In Martha's Quonset structure, something entirely different was happening. The wind hammered the curved metal surface and found nothing to grip. The aerodynamic shape that looked so odd simply shed the wind, let it flow over and around without creating the kind of uplift that tears roofs off conventional buildings. The snow piled against the north side, the windward side, and that pile became its own insulation, an additional thermal barrier. The south side, the lee side, stayed relatively clear because of the shape and the slight overhang Martha had created with extended metal panels. Inside, on the first night of the storm, Martha had burned a larger than usual load in her rocket heater. She'd fed it for perhaps 2 hours, using the driest of her stored wood, sticks of ash and oak that had been split small and seasoned for a year. The combustion was so complete that the exhaust from her chimney was barely visible, just a shimmer of heat against the storm. By midnight, the thermal mass bench was fully saturated with heat. The clay was warm to the touch, that deep, penetrating warmth that comes from radiant heating rather than convection. She banked the heater, closed the dampers, and went to sleep on top of her heat battery. The temperature outside was already 15 below zero, with wind chill making it feel like 40 below. Inside her Quonset structure, in her sleeping space directly above the thermal mass, it was 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The second day she didn't burn at all. She wanted to see what the envelope alone could do, what the thermal mass could hold. She stayed busy with small tasks. She'd sewn extra curtains, had hung them to section off her sleeping area from the rest of the space, creating even smaller zones of warmth. She read by the light of a small LED lantern powered by a solar battery she'd charged in the autumn. She cooked simple meals on a small propane camp stove, nothing that required long cooking times. She listened to the wind try to find a way in and fail, over and over, hour after hour after hour. By evening, the temperature inside had dropped to 65 degrees, still comfortable, still warm enough to move around in regular clothes. The thermal mass was still releasing heat, still glowing with stored energy. Outside, it was 22 below, and the storm showed no signs of ending. She burned again that night, another 2-hour session, bringing the thermal mass back up to full capacity. Then she slept, warm and safe, while the storm tried to kill everything it could reach. The pattern continued. 3rd day, 4th day, 5th day. The storm became a siege, and the siege became something like normalcy. Martha burned once per day, sometimes once every day and a half. She used perhaps a quarter of the wood that a conventional cabin would have required. The thermal mass did its job, absorbing heat when the fire burned, releasing it slowly when the fire was out. The insulated envelope, that ridiculous patchwork of straw and paper and carpet scraps and air gaps, held the heat inside and kept the cold outside. The temperature inside her Quonset never dropped below 60 degrees, and with the curtains drawn around her sleeping space and the warmth rising from the thermal bench, her personal zone stayed between 70 and 75 the entire time. No frost on the inside walls, no condensation dripping from the ceiling, no cold floors, no desperate middle-of-the-night trips to feed a dying fire. Just stable, comfortable warmth, maintained with minimal fuel and maximum intelligence. On the 6th day, the storm broke. The wind died first, falling from a scream to a whisper to nothing in the space of a few hours. Then the snow stopped, the clouds parted, and the sun emerged into a world that had been transformed. Drifts 12 feet high, trees bent and broken, the landscape unrecognizable under its white blanket. And the cold, clear cold that comes after a storm, the kind that makes the snow squeak under your boots and the air burn in your lungs. The delegation that had visited Martha before the storm kept their word. 2 men on snowshoes, trudging through drifts, carrying shovels, expecting the worst. They'd lost a neighbor, an elderly man whose furnace had failed and who'd been found frozen in his recliner. They'd heard stories of burst pipes, of families huddled in single rooms, burning furniture to stay warm. They approached Martha's property with genuine dread, expecting to find the metal structure collapsed or buried, and Martha inside it dead. What they found instead was smoke rising from her chimney, thin and clean. They found a path shoveled from her door to her woodpile. They found Martha herself, outside, splitting wood in the morning sun, dressed in a simple wool coat and work gloves, looking entirely unbothered. She waved when she saw them, invited them in for coffee. They stood in her vestibule, stamping snow off their boots, and when she opened the interior door, they felt the wall of warm air roll out. They stepped inside, and their mouths literally fell open. The space was warm, not barely tolerable, not huddled by the fire warm, actually warm, comfortable, the kind of warmth where you want to take your coat off. She served them coffee. They sat on her thermal bench and felt the heat radiating through their pants. And one of them, a carpenter who'd built a dozen conventional cabins in his life, actually started to laugh. Not mockery, recognition. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Kept herself alive and comfortable through a storm that had brought the entire valley to its knees. And she'd done it in a structure they'd all written off as a death trap. They asked questions. How much wood had she burned? How often? How did the heater work? What was in the walls? She answered patiently, walking them through her system, showing them the rocket heater, explaining thermal mass, describing the insulated envelope. They listened like students, these men who'd thought they knew everything about winter survival, and realized they'd been doing it the hard way their entire lives. Word spread. By the end of the week, Martha had a steady stream of visitors, people who wanted to see the Quonset cabin, who wanted to understand how she'd stayed warm. Some came skeptical and left convinced. Some came curious and left inspired. A few came defensive, unwilling to admit that their conventional wisdom had been wrong, but even they couldn't deny what they'd seen and felt. The structure that everyone had mocked became something else, a landmark, a lesson, proof that efficiency and intelligence matter more than convention and expense. Martha had spent perhaps a tenth of what a conventional cabin would have cost and built something that outperformed structures 10 times its price. Not because she'd used exotic materials or advanced technology, but because she'd understood principles: thermal mass, thermal bridging, air sealing, passive solar gain, thermal envelopes, wind deflection, earth burning. These weren't secrets. They were physics. They were available to anyone who cared to learn, but most people never did because everyone knows how you're supposed to build a cabin, and you don't question what everyone knows, until everyone is cold and you're warm, until everyone is desperate and you're comfortable, until everyone called you stupid and your survival proves them wrong. The winter continued, as winters do, with more cold and more snow, though nothing as severe as that first storm. Martha burned her small fires, slept on her warm bench, and lived her quiet life. The mockery was gone, replaced by a kind of grudging respect, and sometimes by genuine admiration. A few people asked if she'd help them build similar structures. She said she'd be happy to share what she knew, but she wasn't a contractor and she wasn't selling anything. The information was free. The work was theirs to do. By spring, 3 more Quonset-style structures were under construction in the valley. Each one adapted to its builder's situation and resources, but each one following the same basic principles Martha had demonstrated: thermal mass, insulated envelopes, work with physics, not against it, keep it simple, keep it efficient. The valley was learning, slowly, that the wisdom they needed had been right there all along, dismissed and mocked and ignored, but patient, waiting for the moment when survival would require them to see it. Martha expanded her structure that spring, adding a small greenhouse on the south end, using the same Quonset principle but with translucent panels to capture solar heat. The thermal mass of her rocket heater bench extended into the greenhouse, creating a space where she could grow vegetables year-round. The same people who'd written her off as doomed were buying lettuce and tomatoes from her in January. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Martha, though she was gracious enough not to mention it. What Martha had proven wasn't just about staying warm. It was about the courage to think differently, to look at conventional wisdom, and ask whether it's actually wise or just conventional. It was about understanding that the crowd's consensus is often nothing more than shared ignorance, and that survival belongs to those willing to learn and adapt rather than conform and complain. It was about recognizing that the most powerful technologies aren't always the newest or the most expensive, but often the oldest and the most fundamental, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone humble enough to learn them. The metal structure still looks odd, even now. It doesn't look like what people think a cabin should look like, but it stands there on that rocky, windswept property, warm and dry and efficient. A monument to intelligence over convention, evidence that the person everyone called stupid was the only one actually thinking clearly. That storm, that brutal polar vortex that brought the valley to its knees, tested everyone's preparations and found most of them wanting. But it found Martha's Quonset cabin sufficient, more than sufficient, superior. And in the end, that's the only test that matters. Not what everyone says will work, what actually works when the stakes are survival and the consequences of failure are death. 25 degrees Celsius, 77 Fahrenheit. That's what Martha maintained inside her patchwork metal structure while the storm raged and the temperature outside dropped low enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. Not through magic, not through luck, through knowledge, through planning, through the willingness to be mocked and the patience to prove the mockers wrong. And if you found value in Martha's story, if you see something in this tale about thinking differently and building wisely that resonates with your own journey, then I want you to do something right now. I want you to subscribe to this channel because Martha's story isn't unique in its themes, only in its details. There are thousands of stories like this. Stories of people who rejected conventional wisdom and survived because of it. Stories of intelligence defeating adversity. Stories of the individual mind solving problems that the collective mind said were unsolvable. And I'm committed to bringing you those stories, week after week, video after video, because I believe that these stories are more than entertainment. They're instruction manuals. They're proof that you don't need permission from the crowd to build your own salvation. You just need knowledge, courage, and the willingness to work with reality rather than against it. So subscribe, hit that notification bell, join a community of people who understand that the person everyone calls crazy is sometimes the only one actually seeing clearly. And the next time someone mocks your preparation, your unconventional approach, your refusal to do things the way everyone else does them, remember Martha and her metal cabin. Remember that survival doesn't care about consensus. It cares about what works. And what works is what keeps you warm when the storm comes to kill you and fails. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next story.